Everyone's heard of the Boston Tea Party, that night when American colonists tossed tea into Boston Harbor to protest British taxes. But here's the thing, most of what you think you know is wrong. The truth is stranger, more shocking, and far more fascinating than the textbook version. The incident was a protest against the Tea Act and the principle of taxation without representation. It wasn't just about tea. It was about power, freedom, and identity. Stick with me, because in this video, we're diving into 7 surprising facts about the Boston Tea Party that will completely change the way you see this legendary event. Before we jump in, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more hidden history. All right, let's get started. When you hear about the Boston Tea Party, you probably imagine colonists angry about high tea prices. But here's the surprising truth. The Tea Act of 1773 didn't raise prices. It actually made tea cheaper. So why would people destroy 92,000 pounds of it if it cost less? The answer lies in control. Britain gave the East India Company a monopoly, which meant colonists could only buy tea through them. Sure, the tea cost less, but it came with a hidden price, accepting Parliament's right to tax the colonies without giving them representation. To the colonists, drinking that tea wasn't just sipping a warm drink. It was like signing a contract that said, yes, Britain can control us however it wants. That's why they refused it. Think about it in today's terms. Imagine if your government forced you to buy all your smartphones from one single company. Maybe the phone is cheaper, maybe it even works better, but you'd have no choice, no competition, no freedom to decide. That's how the colonists felt about their tea. So the Boston Tea Party wasn't about money. It was about pride, freedom, and the belief that no empire had the right to decide for them. Cheaper tea ended up costing Britain far more than they ever imagined. It sparked a revolution. When you hear about the Boston Tea Party, it feels like the first big moment when colonists stood up against Britain. But here's the twist. Boston wasn't the first place where people rebelled against British tea. Months before December 1773, tea ships ran into trouble in other colonies. In New York and Philadelphia, angry crowds refused to let the tea even be unloaded. In Charleston, South Carolina, colonists seized tea and locked it away in warehouses to rot. These acts didn't make as many headlines as Boston, but they sent the same message: we won't be forced to drink Britain's tea. So why do we mainly remember Boston? Because the Bostonians took it further than anyone else. They didn't just block the tea, they dumped it into the harbor in front of thousands of witnesses. It was bold, it was dramatic, and unforgettable. Think of it like a modern protest. Some people march, some hold signs, but then one group does something so shocking, it grabs the attention of the entire world. That's what Boston did. So the truth is, the Boston Tea Party wasn't a lonely act of rebellion. It was part of a wave of resistance sweeping across the colonies, a wave that was about to turn into a revolution. When people hear about the Boston Tea Party, they usually imagine a few crates tossed into the harbor. But the reality, it was massive. The colonists destroyed more than 92,000 pounds of tea. That's enough to fill nearly 18.5 million tea bags today. The value of that tea in today's money would be over $1 million. Imagine standing on the docks, watching chest after chest split open as the tea poured into the water. This wasn't just wastefulness, though. It was a carefully chosen act of destruction. By targeting such a valuable product, the colonists made sure Britain couldn't ignore their message. It was like saying, we'd rather destroy your goods than submit to your rules. And here's the most surprising part. The protesters were careful not to damage private property. They didn't steal the tea for themselves, they didn't harm the ships or the sailors. Once the tea was gone, they even cleaned up the docks and put everything else back in order. It wasn't a drunken riot, it was a deliberate, disciplined act of protest. So, when we talk about the Boston Tea Party, we're not just talking about some spilled tea. We're talking about a $1 million statement, a rebellion brewed strong enough to change history. Yes, many protesters smeared soot on their faces, wrapped themselves in blankets, and called themselves Mohawks. But the goal wasn't really to hide their identity. In a town as small as Boston, everyone knew who the troublemakers were. Neighbors recognized neighbors, and British officials even wrote down the names of some participants afterward. So, why dress up at all? Two big reasons. First, the Native American disguise was a powerful symbol of freedom and defiance. By calling themselves Mohawks, the colonists were saying, "We're no longer under Britain's control. We're something new, something independent." Second, the disguise added just enough anonymity to protect individuals from being singled out in court. It wasn't perfect, but it gave them a thin layer of safety while still making the protest bold and dramatic. So, the disguises weren't about fooling the British. They were about sending a message. The colonists were ready to stand together no matter the risk. The Boston Tea Party might have lasted only a few hours, but its impact stretched across the world. To Britain, the destruction of so much valuable tea wasn't just rebellion, it was a direct challenge to their authority, and they weren't about to let it slide. In response, Parliament passed what were called the Coercive Acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. They closed Boston Harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for, cut off town meetings, and sent even more British troops into Massachusetts. In other words, they tried to punish Boston so harshly that no colony would dare to rebel again. But Britain miscalculated. Instead of scaring the colonies into obedience, the punishment united them like never before. Colonies that had once been rivals, like Virginia and Massachusetts, suddenly stood together. They sent supplies to Boston, offered support, and started thinking of themselves not just as separate colonies, but as one people with one struggle. And here's where the global twist comes in. Britain's enemies, like France and Spain, were watching closely. When the revolution began, they saw an opportunity to weaken Britain and eventually stepped in to help the Americans. So, one night of tossing tea into the harbor didn't just anger Britain. It set off a chain reaction that would help create a brand new nation and change the balance of power around the world. When we hear about the Boston Tea Party today, it sounds like every colonist was celebrating, cheering as the tea hit the water. But the truth is more complicated. Not everyone supported it. Many wealthy merchants and loyalists were horrified. To them, the destruction of private property was dangerous. If the colonists could get away with destroying British goods, what would stop mobs from turning on local businesses next? Some even believed the protesters had gone too far and that Britain was right to crack down. Even among patriots, there were mixed feelings. Some agreed with the resistance, but worried that this bold act would provoke Britain into an even harsher response. And they were right. Others felt uneasy about wasting so much valuable tea when many families struggled to afford daily goods. But here's what's interesting. Over time, the Tea Party grew into a legend. What some colonists saw as reckless or extreme in 1773, later generations praised as brave and patriotic. It's a reminder that history often smooths out the disagreements and leaves us with a cleaner, simpler story. The Boston Tea Party was the most famous act of tea destruction, but it wasn't the last. In fact, it inspired a wave of similar protests across the colonies. In Maryland, patriots burned a ship carrying tea right in the harbor. In New York, mobs forced tea agents to resign and chased them out of town. Even as late as 1774, a year after Boston, towns across America were still staging their own tea parties, dumping tea, burning it, or refusing to unload it from ships. The idea spread like wildfire. Ordinary people could fight back against an empire by targeting something as simple as a commodity. Tea became more than a drink. It became a symbol of tyranny and resistance. Refusing tea wasn't just about taste, it was about identity. Many colonists even switched to coffee, which soon became America's favorite beverage. So, while Boston's protest grabbed the headlines, it wasn't an isolated act. It was the spark that lit dozens of smaller fires, each one chipping away at Britain's authority. Together, they built a movement that no empire could put out. The Boston Tea Party wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning. And there you have it, 7 surprising truths that prove the Boston Tea Party was far more than just a story about spilled tea. It was a turning point, a symbol, and the spark of a revolution. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep questioning the history you thought you knew.